we start? Yeah, it's a pleasure to have this talk with you. I think we are able actually to follow up directly to the talk of Reed and Henning, at least in a certain way. So those folks are lucky that heard this talk. Follow up, I mean, with the material Henning presented on Laborde and Guattari, because a lot of the work Guattari did is actually connected to our topic, even in his more media theoretical perspective. Laborde, when I remember the title of our session is Tested Souls, no? As the title of your book. Laborde is a program against testing souls in a way, so it's an antidote. And we could follow up also with Reed, new media environments, but this will become clear later, I guess. So I want to start with the first part. Why Schreber, one could ask? Why talking about this book here? In this context, Denkwürdigkeiten eines Nervenkranken, Memoirs of a Nervous Illness, written in February and to September 1900, published in 1903, as we see. Why to take this document as a starting point for an excursion into our long presence, the long now we are discussing here. I mean, what is written down here in this book? What is inscribed here? What gains expression? We could ask. So that reading this book here and decoding the diverse readings of this book, who traveled who traveled through the 20th century, who traversed 20th century, from Freud to Benjamin, to Canetti, to Lacan, Deleuze, Guattari, to Kittler, etc. Why to this? I mean, it's like a message in a bottle, I have the impression. But what can this document unfold? Which plateaus can it unfold that we might understand our long presence? So this is for me the big questions. The big question I have in mind. I mean, I'm not so deep in psychoanalysis as you are, Laurence. I'm not in the history of delusion as you are, and in sci-fi. That's your part then. But I'm speaking more from a point of a media philosopher. And I will proceed in two steps, interrupting myself after the first one and trying to take up my intervention after your intro. And, we should mix up then, I guess. So what I want to start with first, let me try to position Schreber very roughly to begin our conversation with. At least for a media theorist, Schreber's position is highly significant. As you know, probably better than me, it even is entangled with the emergence of a certain question and a certain problem of mediality first, that is significant around 1900, but also it is entangled with the genesis of our whole discipline, if I might say so, that is in itself an offspring of this long now, an offspring somehow of this book, and a discipline, media studies, that claims at least that is able to give a certain understanding of this long now. So, and I want to explain this a bit. Of course, I have to start with Friedrich Kittler here, one of my teachers. He may help me to undertake this, because he wrote in his famous book, Gramophone Film Typewriter, at the very beginning of our presence, I'm not quoting him, but he said something like this: at the very beginning of our presence, we find a separation, a Trennung, and a differentiation, a Differenzierung, at the very beginning of our presence. During the second half of 19th century, so this is the beginning of our presence, according to Kittler, the monopoly of the alphabet has been destroyed. During alphabetism, all flows of data had to pass the signifier. Readers had to hallucinate sensualities. To read meant exactly this, to hallucinate what has to pass the signifier, in order to be somehow represented in text, but already, of course, distorted in a way by this. And that's, by the way, I think now the imperialism of this signifier that Deleuze-Guattari are bringing in. And now around 1880, Kittler says the acoustic and the visual data, they get their own channels, of course through gramophone and film, their own storages. What couldn't be written down before now could be fixed for the first time by technical media, gramophone and film, and even writing got its own technical medium, its own more specific channel, the writing machine. So it is in this technical differentiation for Kittler that destructed the monopoly of the book and of the alphabet, that our presence has been born. We needed this differentiation, and he is really obsessed, of course, by the end of history in the computer. We needed, he says, this differentiation that opened up our presence, and this differentiation led in the end to the universal machine, to the computer, that again would what's the term for aufheben?
Sublate.
That would sublate, in a way, this differentiation. And this transition from the differentiation up to the end of history in the computer is the very essence of our presence for him, I would say. And I think this could be that's the position of Schreber in Kittler's work. The interesting point is, can I go on? Or, yeah?
Please. Yeah.
The interesting point is that Kittler purloined a Schreberian term to describe this epochal transition, as we know, Aufschreibesystem, the writing down system, as it is translated in the English translation of Schreber, and the Kittler book, who was called Aufschreibesystem, has been translated as discourse network. And he wrote, the term discourse network, as God revealed it to paranoid cognition of Senate President Schreber, can also designate a network of technologies and institutions that allow a given culture to select, store, and process relevant data. According to Kittler, our Aufschreibesystem of our presence now, has emerged around 1900, and Schreber's memoir, I would say, is one of the testimonies we have from the emergence of this presence and of this Aufschreibesystem. Of course, it's a distorted testimony. As Freud said, since paranoid always reveals in a distorted form what other neurotics hide as a secret. And therefore, I guess, Schreber is very interesting for us. With Schreber, we have a document of the reveries. I would not speak about, we can discuss this later, about dreaming collectives, not use the term dream, but more the term reverie, Träumerei, Bachelard and others used. It's more a daydream, as you said. A reverie of a society crossing over from an alphabetical to a non-alphabetical or an unalphabetical mode of organization and of operation. Or more precise, of crossing over to its electromagnetic condition, the condition of electromagnetic flows, and that's the first connection to Guattari, also to the flows of Guattari and Deleuze. Today I would even say crossover into its technological condition. During this transition, society somehow lost its alphabetical mind that it had around 1800, entered into a deep crisis of its operational rationality, I would say. It was onto the way of changing its state of mind. Systems of delusions may not always been, but often traversed by the technological condition. So I mean, and Schreber gave us the notion of the Aufschreibesystem to describe this transition. The delusional system he presents to us is, in short, a cosmology and a theology of electromagnetic communication, I would say, even a cosmotechno theology, in attempts a redescription of communication under conditions of electromagnetic field theory and of a, in itself, electrical or signal theoretical thinking of the nerves. I'm sure that we come back to this. I mean, Wolfgang Hagen, my colleague, you know his work called the whole setting Radio Schreber. It is really deeply connected to this kind of reverie. Another side of this reverie is, of course, the modern spiritism or spiritualism. I don't know the English word. Around 1900.
The Germans and the French tended to say spiritism, and the Americans spiritualism.
And this is in the document itself. This neighborhood. This inscription of spiritism in Schreber, and the other, maybe the other way around too. If you say, okay, that's a whole culture that turns in a way a bit delusional, in a form of electromagnetic delusion, is inscribed in the document. So, because in the end of the document, you notice we see the ads, for example, of Aksakhov's Animism and Spiritism, and then if you know the book of, I love this, the Book of Wonder, because Schreber is all about wandering, so the Book of Wonder and the Secret Sciences and so on. So this is inscribed in the document itself. So that's the first plateau. I want to interrupt here myself, because the second thing is about the apparatus of capture around 1900 and about the apparatus of capture in 2000. And I guess we can analyze this thing also via reading of Schreber, but this would be, in a way, the next plateau. So all I wanted to do is now first to situate the document a bit and to have a starting point.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Well, with regard to Wolfgang Hagen's work, he managed to
do we need this?
Reconstruct the affinity between Schreber's memoirs and modern spiritualism down to various details, and it goes on in a very interesting way to talk about how our application of science before it is understood leads to a certain gap that is filled psychotically. So the non-understanding of electricity, which however was being used, creates the same kind of psychotic hole, as it were, that Schreber filled. But what I would want to fold out of that whole discussion and underscore is the testing itself, the test situation, because Hagen talks about how modern spiritualism in the United States emerged in tandem with telegraphy, and thus in tandem with the newspapers that extended coverage from the national to the international in record time because of the telegraphic medium. At the same time, the press kept on bringing to the headlines discussions of, I'm not going to comment on it yet, discussions of spiritualism, undercover reporting that often sought to defraud the mediums, the spiritualist mediums, as mere magicians and so on and so forth. And yet, it is the case that all these same mediums welcomed this newspaper investigation, even if the reporters were intent on exposing them, because any new science, I'm going to call it that, like spiritualism, that has nothing to prove, welcomes the test situation because it applies the status of hypothesis to ghosts, for example. So this test situation, which I've just now taken out of the Hagen book, which is a historical discussion, is the setting for Freud's introduction of the term reality testing, which I think is basic to all of this. And this brings us back to Schreber, which is, of course, a fantasy, a paranoid fantasy or delusional system about testing over and over again. The testing is furthermore something that involves a catastrophe, a mistake on the part of the various gods he conjures up. God or gods can take cognizance only of corpses, because in the overall economy, the divine force only kicks in when humans die so that they can harvest the nerves and bring them back into a kind of Christian heaven. I mean, really, he interrupts Christianity in the course of his delusion. And because...
he translated it actually from a religion of the book into an electromagnetical... it was a resetting in a way of...
Absolutely, which is very close to what spiritualism represents,
exactly.
modern spiritualism. And I should add, in case that wasn't clear, this was a press that specialized in publishing spiritualist books, which means that some readership recognized this as spiritualist. So the paradoxical secularism involved here involves the two options with which Schreber is faced. Either he will be completely merged with God, will become completely woman or whatever is required in order to conceive the divine rays and produce a new generativity of the human species. Or, and that's the option that dominates the book, he will be interrupted again, just as he interrupted the overall system, Christianity. He will be interrupted, and the tested souls, the departed, the ghosts of the departed, will keep on trying to withdraw the nerves from the redemption. This is where science fiction comes in, emphatically and obviously. I will in a minute. This film, which was supposed to have been my document originally, Dark City from 1998, is now playing in the background as a kind of loop, and we will have occasion to refer to it. It's the only science fiction film I know of where Dr. Schreber appears as someone who brokers we'll see him eventually. Someone who brokers an experiment that an alien species conducts with human subjects who have been transported to a platform in outer space. And you'll remember in Schreber's memoirs, he often says, at first when he survives the psychotic break and he assumes he's alone in the world, everything has died. As he begins to resituate himself in reality, he says, well, we must have been taken to outer space.
It's a radical post-human idea he implements, or like Nietzsche's letzter Mensch, the last human, and then he imagines exactly the colonization of other planets.
Right, and this is where the outer space orbit kicks in when the tested souls resist the redemption. They start to anchor their nerve mass in distant planets so that at any moment they can just snap back and not be completely dissolved in the union. So what happens is that the Entmannung, the castration, is deferred, becoming woman is deferred. Everything is transferred to the momentum of postponement, which is perhaps the most radical legacy of the novel. It means, for example, that it's not that he becomes a woman in order to be Mary once again in some retake or remake of Christianity, but he becomes an android, really a female robot who through so-called divine rays enters into the prospect of replication. In other words, not reproduction and death, for example, but the prospect of replication, the prospect of an approximation with technology, something that is ahead of his time. I mean, this is what interests me so much about the Schreber book, is that it's a series of advanced previews that is in its own time missing the coordinates. When I first read the memoirs, I was working on Goethe's Werther, which is a similar kind of book. If you look at its reception, this suicide novel is used as ingredients of a robot queen and the Triumph der Empfindsamkeit by Goethe, then it's one of the three works that Frankenstein's monster consumes and is constituted by.
So it travels all.
Yes, through these internalizations, so that increasingly, as one approaches some end of the reception in time, one senses that Werther's suicide was something like the negative theology of this emergent desire to replicate, which is harbored, of course, by mass psychology, to find an alternative, again, to reproduction and death. So, yeah.
Did I get it right that you think that the test situation, I mean, that is really significant for the whole book, is, I mean, maybe it doesn't have its origin, but one of the central, moments where it comes from is that Spiritism was put into test in the Yugas. I mean, that's a fascinating...
That would be the historical setting, and then somewhere else, Freud is developing a notion of reality testing that becomes basic to the understanding of mourning, for example. I mean, in Mourning and Melancholia, he applies reality testing 3 times, and very ambiguously to understand the process of mourning. One ambiguity or paradox I could mention right away is that every time one uses reality testing to go into the memorial architecture and test for the absence of the deceased, means, of course, that one extends a pseudo, a liminal, a ghostly existence of the deceased in the process. But then in Negation in 1925, he writes that reality testing is simply the term for relating inside and outside, so that one has to find for inner representations, as it were, or identifications, corroboration in perception or reality. He underscores the hope that that object still exists in the outside world. But he says that the whole apparatus, or the whole testing, the momentum is set in process, set going by the loss of an object. So Melanie Klein did not have far to go at all when she reversed the situation and said that what reality is good for, the only thing reality is good for, is that it supplies a certain less muddled version of what is rather fantasy confused in the inner world. But that is then only used in order to test for the security, the living on of the inner objects. In other words, our dead or our ghosts.
I mean, that's your big question, actually. I remember where the deaths are going in the system.
Right.
I would like to come now to a second point. We want to discuss the question of power. And is this okay? Yeah. I have to go back, I think, to a reading what Canetti emphasized during his reading of Schreber in Masse und Macht, Crowds and Power. He says that procedures of power, Machtvorgänge, I didn't know how it is translated, Machtvorgänge always play an essential role for the very structure and the population, he says, I love this phrase, die Bevölkerung des Wahns, the population of a delusion. And this was taken up later again by Deleuze-Guattari in the Anti-Oedipus, I guess, when they took this out of Canetti's reading of Schreber, when you observed against psychoanalysis that delusion is always political. I think this was the kind of Verschiebung they made. So let's say power and the political always traverses delusion. This is, I guess for us here at least, a decisive point. But what could this mean now for a reading of Schreber? I suggest as a next point we have to discuss. And let me briefly develop this. I would like to differentiate now two apparatuses of capture around 1900, the first one about which Schreber writes, and the apparatus of capture around 2000, our apparatus of capture today. And I would try to figure out how to configure these two apparatuses. Foucault wrote in his lecture from 1978, What is Critique? In order to understand the issues and the history of governmentality, or the history of government, des Regierens, we say in German, within which the attitude of critique arose. I mean, he's interested in this problem in this lecture. He says one has to go back to what he calls pastoral activity. It was the Christian pastoral power, die Pastoralmacht, that has developed the idea, he says, and he developed later in this lecture at the Collège de France, that each individual needs to be governed, independent from its age, its position in life, etc., in order to find salvation of the soul. So, having to be governed, that's already a scandal, in every detail of one's activities, to be subjected to operations of steering, regulation, control, according to Foucault, had just been unthinkable for Greek and Latin and Roman antiquity. And he says this arose, governmentality in this sense of Seelenführung, this was the first sense, he says, arose first of all as government of the soul in the frame of the Christian Pastoralmacht. And I think Schreber gives us an insight what governmentality, respect the government of the souls, could mean around 1900. And that's kind of translation he does, you know. After the disciplinary society, there arose another now non-alphabetic government of souls via the steering of nerves, I would put it. Let's say a nervous government, in a way. Schreber's key notions here are, of course, influence, Einfluss, he says, und Wirkung. He's all about Einwirkung all the time. There's some Einwirkung from outside. And nerve contact, how it is translated, Nervenanhang. God himself is a nerve. He creates via rays. Rays are implementations of nerves in concrete situations, he writes. And divine rays, above all, have the power of influencing the nerves of human beings. I mean, that's Seelenführung around 1900. They are influencing our nervous system. And nerves are set in motion from without, he says, from out there, le grand dehors, the big outside in a way. And to make a long story short, Schreber's neurotheology, designed in the Memoirs, I would call it neurotheology, is in fact a distortion of what might be called the technical media's neuropower around 1900. And today we speak more often about psychopower, but I mean he speaks about psychopower in this great text, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I think Schreber's memoirs are an important document for understanding our the 100 years of now, since this is a document of a significant transition within the historicity of power. The new regulation of souls starts to be a regulation of attention, of the nerves, and etc. He it's also a long tractatus on the question of attention, no? Mm-hmm. And of, And this, I would say, is the very beginning of a formation of power that is still ours today. But what means in the case of Schreber around 1900 to be spelled in terms of influence? This can be described in more exact terms today. I mean, that's exactly the same argument that Wolfgang Hagen has with the Spiritism. Mm-hmm. So the lack of an exact description, of course, produced some distorted way of representations, but still it is a representation. We have to read it. Since then, we saw first the rise of neuronal network theory, one of the key fields of the processes of cybernetization that has coupled the wetware of nerves and the software of symbolical logic, and by this made possible the hardware of implementing all this via switching circuits. I mean, this is neuronal networks of Warren McCulloch and Pitts and Foundation of Cybernetics around 1950, or even earlier, but let's say around 1950. We saw then Libet's experimentation of mind time that also goes also back as Henning Schmidtgen. I can refer to Henning, he's here now, has shown in the late 19th century as a question of the transmission speed of nerves. And now we have following this line, and this brings us towards what I would call the apparatus of capture of around 2000. We have affective, atmospheric, environmental media, algorithmic, sensoric media environments, and that's the connection to Orid's intervention before. Operating on a microtemporal scale and implementing a regime of influence taking place already before something has happened. That's what Mark is talking in the backside, in my back, calls feeding forward, not feedback anymore, but feed forward. Brian Masumi has called this preemptive power or onto power, not onto from ontology, but onto, I mean, this, what could you say, beforehead, onto power. A new environmental mode of power by media apparatuses that operationalize affectivity. And affect, of course, that's the quality that's connected to the nerves in a way. I mean, that's the nerves of today. The place of this discourse has the discourse on affect, I would say. And so on. I could go on with this. The data-driven anticipation of the future takes place targeting the operational present of sensibility today. And today's media, to put it again in different terms, are quite apprehensive machines that capture, again this word, that capture affective data. They are clones of the real, like as Luciana Parisi put it. So we see, actually, they have never been media of communication, but media of power. I would turn it then. And if we read Schreber in this way, we can read him in this way. I have the impression that this new contemporary apparatus of capture is a very Schreberian setting, actually, we are living in today.
Yeah, so Deleuze and Guattari and others that we've mentioned choose to look at Schreber as a viable, coherent theory that can be passed along, improvements can be made, certain updates can be introduced, but it's a genuine theory. From the point of view of psychoanalysis and psychohistory, what's so important about the memoirs is that it's evidence that a livable, stabilized relationship to and inside psychosis is possible. It's what Benjamin singled out in his essay, Books by the Insane, from my collection, as the encapsulated quality of Schreber's book. And if you've read any other autobiographical books by psychotics, it's really extraordinary how encapsulated, to continue to use that word, Schreber remains. It takes the form for him, as you recall, that he decides that everyone around him is no longer miraculated up, but has a kind of existence, so he can now enter into diplomatic relations with them.
First he thought, but he was maybe wrong, and he says, I don't know if it has changed the situation or if I have been wrong.
Or beautifully, he says at one point, or maybe the world hasn't changed, but something has changed inside me. But this decision to live, well, he introduces this shift he will live with his environment, accept their basic reality. But he continues carrying forward his delusional system, and yet rehabilitated, living alongside the formerly miraculated up men in his society. I think that is something that psychoanalysis or psychohistory would catch up with, as it were. The break after psychoanalysis rather early, or Freud rather early, encountered the Memoirs, this document of an encapsulated break, which really was the first reading of Psychosis. He kept his distance from Psychosis. Psychosis was the outer limit. And yet there's this paradoxical instance of the livability at that limit. And this comes up in a big way, to get back to 100 years from now.
I mean, okay.
I was just going to mention this quickly before I forget. Via the shell shock epidemic during World War I, which for the first time gave psychoanalysis an inside view of where the psyche breaks, but also could be immunologically protected against that rupture, which led to a whole reception by military psychologists and so on, that sought to exploit that brief reading of war neurosis that Freud offered in his introduction to psychoanalysis and the war neuroses. Something that the Frankfurt School referred to as the reversal of psychoanalysis. In other words, using this inside knowledge or view to protect one population and weaken another one through propaganda or what have you, and so on and so forth. But the basic trend, to bring it out of the war zone for a moment, in all disciplines of psychological investigation and treatment, was to reconsider the norm, the working norm, as something that now had to be readapted to the psychoticizing impact of technologization. This comes up in countless psychotechnical essays on the relationship, for example, between pilots and their flying machines, or drivers and their tanks, and so on. How does the new technologization of warfare, as the advanced preview of technologization in life overall, how does that change what is required for the human to enter into a relationship with this machine?
So this would be another form of power inscription, actually.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. Based on the advanced preview, again, that Schreber's book had given of the livability within psychosis, because that's what one was increasingly after. The disabling dissociation of war neurosis that Freud had sketched in 1919 was used now to create a kind of balance within dissociation that was increasingly promoted as the best possible human preparedness for interrelations with technology. Dissociation was an important defense all of a sudden, was originally a psychotic defense, was now a very important defense in the relation with technologization. Freud would finally catch up with all of this in his 1927 essay on fetishism, when he talks about the two non-sexological patients, the sons who lost their fathers, but seemed not to know that the fathers were dead. And he says, well, what's surprising is they're not psychotic. It goes against every single hermeneutics of psychosis that we've used up to now in demarcating the limits of psychoanalytic knowledge, for example. And he says it's because these sons both know and don't know that the father is gone. So this is dissociation, this oscillation
5 minutes.
between the two judgments.
But what happens now? I mean, I'm interested in this really, in these different modes of reading Freud, and you mentioned Deleuze Guattari, who take this as a theory in itself, and Freud as a document of a livable psychosis. how would you describe what is happening in this kind of shift in the reading of Schreber? And what could cause this in a way? I mean, of course, they have a complete different program, and they use Schreber, of course, to destroy our psychoanalysis.
I would say what I was describing uses the encapsulation in Schreber to expand the psychoanalytic field of therapy and understanding, whereas the Deleuzian school chooses instead to pay more respect to the document of Schreber's memoirs and to make of that a tradition. Yeah, I mean, you choose.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, because they already insist on the media historical, I would say, inscriptions of the text, and for them Schreber is of course an example, or maybe the example for leaving or destroying the imperialism of the signifier, and this has of course many historical reasons in this book. Computerization, of course, and other. They speak about the new electric language, the language of flows, and so on. And they see in Schreber already this kind of rupture being at least the stream underneath who informs the whole text and how it expresses paranoia.
For reasons of their own, they want to dislodge psychoanalytic authority. And so the Schreber text, comes in very usefully for that. But in his essay, Books of the Insane, by the Insane, Benjamin curiously says that he can't really remember when it comes to first contact with the memoirs, whether he read the book first or first learned about it through Freud. Yeah. He says it's all the same. In the sense, this hybrid, Schreber and Freud, which leads us into the psychohistory, I just sketched very briefly, that's the one track. And the other track is Schreber
and what is
the
Kittler
psycho
saying?
flows.
Yeah. And Kittler says, I mean, these works, Benjamin's, not knowing what comes before, comes from the fact that both belong to the same discourse network. That's the argument of Kittler. Therefore, Freud reads a lot of of psychoanalysis already present in the work of Schreber. And this is a fantastic argument, I guess, from Kittler, who says...
Friedrich can't be confused with Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah, that's true. Exactly, yeah. Okay, so I guess do you want to bring in another plateau? We have a few. Did you comment on this? No. Okay.
Did you say that we were given the 5-minute?
Yeah, notice? It's long ago. So
okay.
Do you want to bring in another plateau, or should it just...
Another plateau.
Another
the only thing I wanted to say is there are two selections here. One is of this billboard of Shell Beach. You might recall in the film Dark City, which is all about changing memories experimentally every night of a tuning. It's really a collective dreaming or daydreaming as the site for changing fixities. That's why I think it's closer to daydreaming than to dreaming. And the only exception throughout the colony or the laboratory space of Dark City is this Shell Beach place. Everyone has been there. Everyone has the memory. The memory is not changed or altered after every tuning. And yet everyone knows the way to Shell Beach and tells you the way up to a certain point, and they have to pull up short before an actual realization of the way. So it functions just like traumatic oblivion, according to Freud in the fetishism essay. The fetish only goes up to the point of forgetting or a repression. And yet it is along this edge, of course, where the dissociation and fetishism, or for the sons with the lost fathers, works. So Shell Beach is the legacy of shell shock in a sense. What was introduced as a complete disorder that Freud wrestled down into an internal map of a doubling of the ego between the peace ego and its doppelganger, the war ego. This in turn opens up in at the latest in Freud around the dissociation and fetishism, which I think goes into Benjamin's media essays as the gadget love that allows the people who are twitteringly preoccupied with the dials on the console to control the transformation of shocks into shots of inoculation, which then can be self-administered. So that, I guess, was the only
I have one question left, actually, with which we can close. I mean, you brought up at the very beginning the question of testing in your first statement, and the test situation, and we spoke about that. But what about today, or how about today? Is testing, in what sense testing is still our issue? We could close, I guess. I mean, for example, what Ori showed in her talk was, I remember now because it was so funny that she brought it up. That was her first, one of her first slides on Sangdu, this smart city as a test bed, you know, for contemporary living in, I don't know, smart environments or so. So the test situation seems, of course, be still with us, you know. That's nothing historical we're talking about.
No, I mean it's intrapsychic or metapsychological. I mean, as soon as I keep the focus on reality testing, it's clear that I'm talking about something as basic as the continued existence of the ego in an environment. And as basic as mourning, finally. It's really where the relationship to mourning is given the most emphatic theorization in psychoanalysis. It's part of the demarcation of the environment in time.
Okay, so...
Thank you.
Thank you. We're done.